Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me. It would have been very lonely if none of you had turned up. Um, I hope you're all well. I can see a few familiar faces. Hi, Darren. I can see you on my screen down there. Um, this session is going to take about 45 minutes to an hour, and I am going to record the session. So if any of your colleagues want to watch it later on Catch Up TV, like they would on Emmerdale, I'll send you all the links look through and you can share it with your colleagues. So I'm just going to load up my screen for you. So you should be able to see that now. So we're going to take a look at the latest facts and figures from the European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, from their 2025 annual safety review. And then we're going to look at two very similar case studies, but which have two very different outcomes. If you can just turn your microphones on mute for me, that'd be a great help. Thank you. So when we train first aid and emergency procedures, it's sometimes easy to forget when we're doing it day in and day out why we're actually doing it. And of course, we're doing it for safety, but actually, we're also doing it because it's a regulatory requirement. And this regulation comes from EU 952/2012, and it states that all cabin crew must be trained in pre-flight duties, passenger briefing, emergency procedures, security, and customer service. There are then further regulations which mandate what must be trained in cabin crew's initial operator conversion, aircraft type specific, senior upgrade, recurrent, and triannual training. Now, when we put training courses together for airlines, we always try and keep it fresh and as current as possible. And I'm probably going to make some of you feel very old now. But when the cabin crew now come in, our youngest crew, they were not alive when 9/11 happened. And some of them weren't born when Concorde stopped flying in 2003. So we have to make it really relatable and what's going on in the industry in terms of safety standards to make it really compliant for them and to make it interesting for them. And a really good place to start to do that is by looking at the annual safety review from EASA to see what the current trends are. So as I go through this, I am going to be reading out names of airports and airlines, and I apologize now for my appalling pronunciation of them, but I'm just going to blame it on my Manchester accent for the time being. So first up, let's take a closer look at the facts and figures. Typically, my work phone has just started to go. So ignore that ringing in the background for me. So this graph shows the fatalities across the world in aviation. So what you can see in dark blue there is what's gone on across the globe. And what you can see in the lighter blue is what's happened in Europe. Now, in Europe, we've been fairly lucky in the past few years, and we haven't had a significant crash since 2015, which was the German wings incident. However, last year there were still 3 fatalities within the European member states. Now, when we talk about EASA, that includes countries within Europe and also members that countries that subscribe to EASA, such as Liechtenstein and Iceland. Now, within those 3 incidents, I'm going to tell you now, I apologize because the first one is a little bit gory, but that happened at Amsterdam Airport on May the 29th last year. And that was a ground employee who committed suicide by walking into a running aircraft engine. The next fatality in Europe last year happened on November the 25th, and that's when an aircraft, a Boeing 737, crashed at Vilnius. It was a cargo airplane, and on its final approach, it impacted the ground and the pilot lost his life. Then the third and final incident last year happened on board an Airbus A220, and that was an immediate diversion to Graz Airport in Austria, sorry. and an emergency evacuation commenced. And again, that had one fatality. Now, in general aviation, there was 27 fatal accidents with 44 fatalities on one fatal balloon accident last year. Now, in the UK, we are really lucky that we have a brilliant safety record. And the last significant crash was in 2008. And that was the British Airways flight that crashed at London Heathrow Airport, and everyone survived. The last significant fatal incident in UK was in 1995. That's 30 years ago. And that was at Leeds Airport, and 12 people on board. The night air flight 816, which was a domestic flight from Leeds to Aberdeen, crashed on takeoff. Now, worldwide, there were 3 fatal accidents last year that had, which contributed the most to the fatalities that we saw. Now, the first one was an ATR that crashed into Sao Paulo in Brazil, and 62 fatalities on that. And then we had the flight that crashed in Kazakhstan with 38 fatalities, and that was through technical external interference. And that's the posh word for it in the safety report, but what that actually means was it was shot down by a Russian missile. And then the third fatal crash that we had was the Boeing 737, which landed without landing gear, and slid across the runway into a concrete barrier. And there was 179 fatalities on that incident. Now, if you're looking at that chart and you are wondering what is general aviation, why is that so different to civil aviation? It's basically flights which take place through the private sector, whether that's recreational, business, flight training, or emergency services. It's basically any sort of flight that you wouldn't get on as a normal charter or scheduled flight. Now, I've got a few more graphs for you here, and this next one is showing you from 1970 to 2024, in the light blue, the fatalities that are caused by unlawful interference, and that includes bombs, hijackings, or aircraft that have been shot down. Now, as you can see, from 1970, the numbers of these have reduced significantly over the years. However, from 2014, they've started to re-emerge, and they now represent a fifth of the total number of recorded fatalities. Now, this graph shows significant fatal incidents caused by unlawful interference, including the data from Air India Flight 182. Now, that was a 747, and that was brought down off the coast of Ireland after a bomb was planted on board, killing 329 people, and that was back in 1985. You probably all familiar with the next one, and that's in 1988, which was the Lockerbie disaster, which accounted for 270 fatalities. And then from last year, that you can see is pointed out on that graph, is the flight that I've already mentioned in Kazakhstan with 38 fatalities. Now, as well as the fatalities in Europe, we did also have some serious injuries, which are all recorded on safety reports and sent into EASA. These included injuries to cabin crew because of an abrupt stop on a runway from an aircraft, injuries due to severe turbulence, a passenger falling down the air stairs, and a member of ground handling getting trapped by the landing gear, and a flight coordinator getting injured whilst walking behind a running engine. So some quite gory incidents there. Now, some of you may have noticed on my previous slide, I mentioned a hot air balloon. Now, hot air balloons are not the only balloons that cause significant impact to civil aviation. Now, this is from a BBC report from last month, and this is currently impacting Lithuania at the moment. So there are lots of people who are trying to smuggle cigarettes across the borders by using these weather balloons from Belarus. And Lithuania shot down 25 of these balloons in the past year. Now, last month alone, it resulted in 112 flight cancellations, affecting 16,500 passengers. Now, these balloons would risk significant risk to any aircraft if they were injected into the engine or if they were to hit the aircraft in any way. Now, you can actually see on that picture on the left-hand side that that's a balloon that's left Belarus and landed in a car park in Poland. Now, I've spoken about this year's safety review, but I'm going to talk about last year's safety review because it was so important and it warned us about the significance of lithium batteries. And many airlines heeded that warning. So we had Emirates and Singapore Airlines, which have banned power banks from being carried on board an aircraft. Now, what you can see here is an image of Air Busan Flight 391. And that was flying from Busan to Hong Kong on the 28th of January this year. And the aircraft caught fire whilst it was preparing to take off. And the fire resulted in 27 injuries as the aircraft was evacuated. And the preliminary report states that the fire was likely caused by a power bank in the overhead locker, which self-ignited due to a fault in its insulation. So if you look at that picture, and just think that that was caused by a power bank. And I'm going to show you a video now of exactly what happened when the aircraft went up in flames. So he said 3 people suffered injuries there, but actually later, when they rounded everyone up, it was 27 injuries that the evacuation caused. And what we are starting to see is lots and lots of videos online of these lithium batteries that are filmed from on board. And there was one just last week on a China Airlines flight. And it's because of this rise in lithium batteries that we've had to start now changing the way that we train cabin crew with dealing with onboard fires. Now, the first thing we try and do is get our learners to realize just how many of these lithium batteries there are that are on board an aircraft. So asking a simple question of how many personal electronic devices do you have on you today will start to give the learners an idea of just how many are carried on board. Most people have a smartwatch, an iPhone, an iPad, a laptop, and they've all got those batteries on. Now, if you take them aboard an aircraft cabin, even an A320, you'd probably be looking at about 600 lithium batteries on board. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have trained the fire triangle before, where usually to put a fire out, we would remove the oxygen, the heat, or the fuel. Now, what you can see on this picture is a new element that's been added, and that is the chain reaction, and that is in relation to a lithium battery fire, or the PED fire, as we would call it on board. So how do you take away the chain reaction? How do you stop the change and put out the fire? Well, I'm going to share with you now, this is our firefighting drill that we use at SkyPeople Training on our attestation course. So the first thing that we need to do, like we would do with any fire, is move all the passengers away from the area. And then what we're going to do is summon assistance. So we want to get our other cabin crew to go and get us our firefighting equipment, such as the fire extinguisher and the fire gloves. And they're definitely going to need the fire gloves to deal with a PED fire. Now, the next thing we want to do to try and stop that thermal runaway that's happening to that lithium battery is to remove the power. So if it's being charged on board, so if it's connected to a seat and the seat has a socket, we're going to remove that and try and stop that current of electricity going into it. Now, if it's got flames, we're going to use the fire extinguisher to put the flames out. And once they've been put out, we're going to douse it with water because we need to cool that battery down. That's the only way that we're going to stop that thermal runaway. Now, a good way to do this would be to bring an Atlas box to the mobile phone or the laptop and completely submerge it in water. Now, you would always bring the water to the PED and not the PED to the water. And that's because if you're taking the PED through the cabin, you've got a really high chance of it self-igniting again. And you don't want to be doing that when you've got lots of passengers around you. So once you've allowed that PED to cool for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, we're then going to move it to a safe location, which would normally be in the rear of the passenger cabin. And then we're going to monitor it for the rest of the flight. So that really is one of the significant changes that we've seen from EASA in the last 12 months and reacting to really what's going on board the aircraft. Now, before I leave that safety review behind and move on to a case study, I'm just wondering if we've got any questions about that. You can press the you raise the hand toggle if you have. No? Okay. So we'll move on then. And we're going to look at two case studies involving accidents from general aviation. Now, these aircraft have 19 seats or less, so they don't have to carry cabin crew. They often have a service crew member on board who doesn't have any safety training behind them. Now, this case study involves a Bombardier Challenger 600 operated by Platinum Jet Management. And on the morning of the 2nd of January 2005, this is what happened. You can see the picture on the screen. It was a private charter departing Teterboro Airport, New Jersey, on its way to Chicago Midway Airport. On board were 2 pilots, 1 cabin aide, and 8 passengers. Just after 7:18 a.m., the aircraft began its takeoff roll, but within seconds, it became clear that something wasn't right. The plane accelerated down the runway and reached about 110 knots, but it couldn't get airborne. The nose simply wouldn't lift off the ground. Now, the Challenger ran off the end of the runway, tore through an airport perimeter fence, shot across a 6-lane highway, hitting a moving vehicle, then crashed into a parking lot and slammed into a building where it caught fire. 2 pilots and 2 people in the car were seriously injured. The passengers and cabin aide, as well as 1 person in the building, received minor injuries, but it could have been a lot worse. And as you can see from that, the aircraft was destroyed. Now, what happened afterwards when the investigation uncovered a series of safety failures? And the main cause was that the flight crew failed to verify the correct weight and balance of the aircraft before it departed. But it didn't stop there. The company, Platinum Jet, was operating illegally without a license to conduct charter flights. But there's a part of this story that's particularly important and relevant to us who train cabin crew, and that's the actions of the cabin aide on board. Now, according to the NTSB, the cabin aide assigned to this flight had not received any sort of safety training whatsoever to be on board an aircraft. Now, that's perfectly legal in this situation because don't forget, if you've got less than 19 seats, you don't have to carry a cabin crew member. Now, because she hadn't had any safety training, she didn't perform a seatbelt check before departure, which meant that 2 passengers were not restrained during the violent impact. She also lacked a clear understanding of how to open the cabin door in an emergency operation. After the crash, instead of assisting passengers, she actually left the aircraft before anyone else. And it must have been the shock value because she was later picked up by a passing car after she'd abandoned the crash site. But this is a clear example of what can happen when someone is put in a crew role without the proper training. So the position may have been titled cabin aide, but it came with all the responsibilities of cabin crew. And it's not enough to simply be present in the cabin. Cabin aides must be trained, competent, and ready to lead in under pressure. Yet, with current regulations, and they've not changed following this incident, they simply don't need any training. And operators can choose whether to save the cost of training over safety on board. Now, I'm going to move on to a very different case study. It's similar, but it has a different outcome. And the aircraft involved was a Challenger 604 operated by Hopperjet, and it was flying in February last year. It was a routine flight until the aircraft had a dual engine failure mid-air, and the pilots had no choice but to attempt an emergency landing, not at an airport, but on the Florida interstate. Okay, so I'd like you to try and picture yourself on board that aircraft and what it must have been like. You're on that private jet, you're in controlled airspace, it's a really normal flight, and then all of a sudden you lose both engines and you are coming down around that traffic in the city. Um, and there's no runway in sight and nowhere to go but the freeway. Now, the landing was violent, the aircraft was heavily damaged, and fire broke out, and the main cabin doors and emergency exits were blocked by flames. Now, according to the preliminary NTSB report, the flight attendant who had received training from previously working on a regular commercial flight, so that means that she, your normal airlines that she used to work with, and then she become a private cabin crew attendant. She realized what was going on and she assessed the situation. She made a split-second decision to lead the passengers to an alternative exit, and she used the baggage compartment door in the tail section of the aircraft. Now, she wouldn't have known to do that if she hadn't have had any previous training. Now, despite the chaos and danger, the coordination of the evacuation, guiding everyone safely off through the rear of the exit, of the 5 occupants on board, the pilot and the co-pilot were killed. 3 other occupants were transported to the local hospital with minor injuries. Of the 4 people in the vehicles that were struck by the aircraft, 3 were uninjured and 1 received minor injuries. Now, the flight attendant had actively used the skills that she had learned from her commercial flying days, and she'd never received any training since she left commercial flying and went into the private sector. But that is what helped her in that situation, and that's why she was able to lead in that incident rather than facing that fight or flight syndrome that we'd seen in the previous case study. And it really goes to show the importance of what educators do in terms of cabin crew training and supporting learners and making sure they have all the information they need to deal with these incidents. Now, further supporting the importance of crew training is the successful evacuation of the JAL Flight 516 in January last year. Now, on the 2nd of January 2024, a JAL Airlines Airbus A350 collided with a Dash 8 aircraft operated by the Japan Coast Guard, and that was in Tokyo, Japan. The collision ignited fires that destroyed both of the aircraft, and 5 of the 6 crew on board the Dash 8 all passed away. Now, if you look at the actual Japanese Airlines aircraft, it's pretty unbelievable that anyone survived that, but they did. All 379 people on board survived. Now, 17 people received slight injuries during the evacuation, but I think that's pretty much unbelievable when you look at what went on. Now, the cabin crew had to use megaphones because the PA systems didn't work, and only 3 of the emergency slides were usable. So it just goes to show you how well trained these crew were. Now, aviation analyst Alex, I can't pronounce his surname, so forgive me, I think it's Macaris, commented that the crew initiated a textbook evacuation. So I realise what I've spoken about so far has been pretty doom and gloom. And before I end this section of the webinar, really, I wanted to end on a inspiring story. So what happens after a crash? And I'm going to tell you the story of the woman who fell to earth. And this is Julianne. And Julianne was on board a Lanza flight 508 from Lima to, again, forgive my pronunciation, Pucallpa. I've said that completely wrong. You can Google it later, in Peru. And the crash is the deadliest incident caused by lightning, killing 91 on board. Julianne was the sole survivor, and she fell 10,000 feet while strapped to her seat to the Amazon rainforest below and survived. And she did so with only a broken collarbone, concussion, and with a laceration on her arm. She spent 11 days alone in the jungle wearing a short summer dress. And after losing 1 sandal on the fall to earth, she stepped forward through the rainforest using her left foot to avoid stepping on any snakes. Now, at the age of 14, she left Lima with her parents to establish a research centre in the Amazon rainforest, and that's where she learned some survival skills. And Julianne spent most of the 11 days following a creek to a river, and she survived by eating a bag of candy that she found at the crash site. However, after 4 days, she ran out of these candies, and she survived then only by drinking water. On the 10th day, she found a boat and a path that led alongside it. Discovering a hut, she spent a night in there, and inside the hut there was a tank of gasoline, and she used that tank of gasoline to pour it on her wound to kill the maggots that had infected it. The next day, she heard human voices and was rescued by a group of local men. Now, if you'd like to learn more about Julianne's story, you can do so by searching for her name on the BBC Sounds app, and there's a podcast on there which has her really inspiring story and how she
Mike,
survived those 11 days. Yes?
sorry to interrupt you. I did have my hand up. I don't deliver the cabin crew City and Guilds qualification anymore because it's been pulled from funding, and I'm sure a lot of others on here are the same. But the reason I want to just interject there is obviously for the survival unit that I used to deliver, to get the distinction in that unit, they had to give a real life example of survival, and many of my students used this very one. So I had to mark it time and time again and know it rather well.
Oh, brilliant. Do you know there's quite a few. If you go onto, it might help everyone else as well. There's quite a few on the BBC Sounds app of not only Julianne's story, but there's several other stories. One of them is very similar of another woman who fell to earth, who was the sole survivor. But if you Google survival stories on the BBC Sounds app, they will come up. There's also a brilliant one about a crash in a desert. So I know we always talk about protection locations and survival in different scenarios, but I sometimes think it's really hard to find one that actually happened in the desert, and this is a brilliant one. If you email me, in fact, I'll email you all afterwards with a link to it, and then you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So that is Julianne's story. Absolutely fascinating survival story. Now, that's it really for this part of the webinar. And I just wanted to continue by saying, well, first of all, do you have any questions for me? Don't be shy. No? Okay. If you have enjoyed this webinar and you are interested in CPD events, please do come and join us in June at our next CPD conference. I know I always say our next one's going to be bigger and better than the previous one, but we've already got the tickets on sale for next year. And we've already got our lineup of speakers. And to give you some idea, we've got Virgin Atlantic talking about the Virgin Flair and what goes into making the Virgin brand. We have Symbiotics, who are they basically look at the psychology behind cabin crew and pilot training, and they work with airlines all over the world. We also have Securicare, who are going to be discussing the rise and resolution of disruptive passenger behaviour, and they're also going to be running mini sessions on how to, well, you might have to use this maybe in your personal life, but how to restrain passengers. But it'll be a really good session to join in on. We've also got the Manchester Airport Group discussing their plans for a sustainable future. And that blank space at the bottom, actually yesterday we confirmed that the Department for Transport will be there as well. I think most of you know me by now, or you've met me over the past few years, whether that's been through a college visit or at one of our conferences. And you know I'm really passionate about linking our education and industry. And I just wanted to show you how our figures had grown over the past few years. And these are all the previous academic years. And what we're working on now is 25-26 academic year. And unbelievably, we already have surpassed the 2025, the 24-25 figures with our bookings. So, I just want to say a huge thank you, because I know the work that goes into any sort of college visit to SkyPeople. But I hope you find it all worthwhile. Now, We do offer college workshops as well. So if you would like us to come to you and deliver a unit, we can do so with the units that are on your screen now. And what I really recommend for Gen Z or Gen Z learners is the crew resource management. And because what we do in that session is we look at also personality and accountability for you to go into a professional working environment. Um, What we also do is cabin crew attestation courses, and our next course is in February. It's 5 days online and then 1 day in our training centre in Manchester. And this is really for your learners. Although you as instructors and lecturers are more than welcome to join these courses. Now, for those of you who don't know, cabin crew training is split into three. So I've tried to show you that on the screen. And the first part is the cabin crew attestation. That's essentially your license to fly. The second part is the operator conversion course. So, for example, if you went to work for British Airways or Jet2 or any other airline, that's where you would learn the air operator conversion course. And then the final part of the training is your aircraft type specific. Now, that cabin crew attestation is the learners to keep, and they can take that to any airline. Now, the benefit is when some airlines condense the rest of their training. So if you already have a cabin crew attestation, it means the airline doesn't have to train the learner that part of the attestation. And we're starting to see a trend now where airlines are requesting that candidates have this before they apply. And to give you an example of that, I'll show you this next screen. British Airways now when they open up their applicants for cabin crew, they open up two applications. One is for those with no experience, and one is for with cabin crew attestation. So if you do have an attestation, you can be fast tracked onto a course earlier. And that's the same with Norse and the same for Aer Lingus UK. And what Norse and Aer Lingus actually do is a successful candidate will be sent to SkyPeople if they don't have an attestation. Ascend also, well, they did used to do that. They've just started doing their own attestation, but Wiz also have a fast track course for people who already have their attestation. So it's really worth learners getting this before they apply. We've had some great success. We trialed this last year in June. We had a learner from Leeds City College who left Leeds on the Friday, joined us on the Monday. We set her up with an interview for Ryanair, and she started at Ryanair the following week. So it really was industry to education in a matter of 10 days. So yes, Karen, I can see your hand's gone up there.
Right, I'll just quick out to take my mic off. It's a long time doing the calls. Just for the dates, Mike, have you got dates that far ahead for like when we obviously finish our curriculum? Because I think we finish obviously end of May, beginning of June. Have you got dates for that? Just to be an interesting to put out to the students now for them to think ahead.
Yeah, here you go.
Oh.
It's literally my next
Too
slide
quick.
for you. So we've got a course in February, which is the February half term, and that's 5 days online and then 1 day in Manchester. And then we've got 3 courses in June. One is online. I think the earlier one in June coincides with the Scottish colleges. I didn't say that very well, did I? The Scottish colleges which break up earlier than the English colleges. So, and then we've got the later one in June for the rest, and then we have an in-person course, which is the last course that we do, and that's really beneficial because that is all done at our training centre in Manchester. So if your learners are able to come to Manchester, I really recommend that in-person one. Now, I know some colleges, you have learners from lots of different areas and they're not all cabin crew. However, if you did have learners who really wanted to do this, we can deliver this course on campus at your college. And these are the costs, and it obviously gets cheaper the more people that you do it. And what we actually don't mind is if you wanted to deliver this, you can either deliver it in 6 days in a row, or you could deliver it 1 day a week for 6 weeks. You can also come together with colleges in your area to form a class of students if you wanted to do that. to put on an attestation course. I feel like I have almost trying to tell you a timeshare there with that at the end, but I just wanted to let you know actually what we do for colleges and the services that we provide. But thank you all so much for coming. And I hope you've going to take something away from today's session. If you do have any questions, my email address is mike@skypeopletraining.co.uk, but I'll be sure to send a link out to you all with a recording of this session so you can share it with your colleagues. Eleanor, I was so glad that you're here. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Mike. I just wanted to reiterate, what Mike's just been saying. I teach on the NCFE cabin crew course, and I put myself forward for the attestation cabin crew course last year. I did it online. I'm based in Nottinghamshire, and actually it was really, really beneficial for me as a teacher to then bring it back over across to my learners for this year. So even though I'm not thinking of going in the airline, although after the week I did think of let's try and apply and let's change jobs, I really found the attestation beneficial. So if you as tutors can put yourself in that position, it's definitely well worthwhile. And I also picked up a contact with Meg Bagan from Ryanair as well, who has also come in to tell us about the Ryanair jobs. And so she's also kind of half met some of our learners. So if they now apply, it's almost like a fast track as well. And I will be pushing this for learners to come and do the course if they want to, because I know I've got quite a few of them who want to do it. So whether they'll come up to Manchester or whether we can try and get them online. But definitely as tutors, give it a go. It's well worth it.
Perfect.
And the practical day was really, really much fun.
Oh, thank you. I'll pay you later for saying all that good stuff. Thank you so much. But no, it's the great benefit because as part of that attestation, they do all the practical elements as well in Manchester, which includes going in the swimming pool and the ditching. And the UK attestation doesn't involve the smoke-filled cabin and operating the doors like the European, the EASA one does, but we do it anyway because that's the benefit of our training centre in Manchester. But any questions at all before we finish? No? Okay. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you all in our training centre soon. But definitely take care and see you soon. Thank you.